Hey, everybody, this is Perch. How have things aged for you? The funny thing is, our memories tend to take things that are modestly bad and turn them into horrifically bad over time. And then you watch or read them years later, and you realize this memory you have of this really awful piece of content was just mostly boring, not even that bad. Same thing happens with good things. We have minorly good feelings about things, and then you go back and you read them. We say it didn't age well, but really what didn't age well was us, was our memories of things. That's really what didn't age well. Many comics and movies and other things are products of their time. And if they were kind of shallow and crappy back then, maybe we were excited to see a movie. Maybe we were reading a comic book for the first time. There was some memory other than the actual piece of content we were watching or reading that's making it feel and sound better. I go back and I read a lot of old comics for sure. And it's funny how things modify for you. And, some things hold up. So, for example, I enjoyed Preacher when it first came out. I've gone back and reread that a few times, and it is wonderful as a series. There's different layers to it as I've gotten older, as I've seen and done different things. Certainly the series has changed in my mind, but it's it is held up. I thought it was great then. I think it's great now. The Dark Phoenix saga is another one. It gets held up a lot as being a really great, tight story. It holds up and does quite well for me. Other things, they change over time. So I remember, thoroughly hating a lot of Thor comics back in the 70s and the 80s. And, and I have this bad memory about them. And I went back and read a bunch and found that in many cases, just not a lot was going on with the story. There didn't seem like there was a lot of stakes, but they really weren't bad at all. They were just, regular old decent comic stories. It's funny. And then, of course, there's also the scenario where, there's some other reason why you want to remember things fondly or not fondly. One of the that's come up recently is, Disney has just changed Splash Mountain, this ride, from, the Briar Rabbit, Briar Fox, Briar Bear, cartoon animals kind of doing things. You get wet on this ride. It's not a very, the funny thing is, we have maybe as a kid ridden the Splash Mountain ride, and you may have this memory of this being this epic ride, and maybe that's because you waited 45 minutes to get into it, or maybe, all things considered, if you're wanting to go on thrill rides, Disney is not really the place to go. There's not that many of them. There's a few, but, compared to Six Flags or, or even Universal, you really only have your Thunder Mountain, Splash Mountain, Space Mountain, and then the Mine Train, but there's not a lot of big thrill rides there. So it sticks in people's heads as being amazing. But when all things considered, it's really like you get in a cart, you float around a bit, you go up, and then you go down, and that's it. But it's based off of a movie called Song of the South. And Disney has distanced themselves heavily from this movie because it basically, the setting and the scenery was, slave time of America. And the reason why I think they've distanced is not necessarily that they're trying to pretend they never had anything to do with slavery, because it was a period piece. So it's not like, slavery didn't happen. It happened. But in the movie, the slaves are generally presented as having a great time and singing, and, everything is pretty cheerful. So that's why they've distanced themselves. But what's interesting is people view that movie in super extremes. It's either one of the most racist films ever in the entire history of the world, a dark stain on Disney's history, and it must be hidden and buried as much as possible. Or you get the opposite. You get people like, this was an example of great storytelling and great content. But it's funny, and people have treasured this idea of having it on videotape, or they've burned it onto, I think you could download it in various places, but not officially, of course. But if you actually sit down and try and watch this movie, and I defy, by the way, anyone who's thinking this in their head, your memory of what that movie is probably different from what that movie actually is. The movie is terrible. It's boring as hell. The crux of this film is this boy is basically, mom gets married and the boy is dropped off at a plantation. He's unhappy and thinking about running away, and he's not happy to be there. And then he befriends one of the slaves on the plantation, and some stories exist. But the majority of this movie is just a very dull, like Disney, Friday night theater type movie. It's just a boring ass film. But most people remember about the 15 minutes or so of the cartoon, Briar Rabbit trying to evade Briar Fox, Briar Bear, and the whole Tar Baby stuff and everything. I mean, you remember this animated piece, but there's very little of actually that in the movie. So it always makes me laugh a bit when people are like, "Oh, this is one of the greatest films Disney's ever made." It's like, no, you're thinking that because you are objecting to the idea of Disney censoring it or going away. And now maybe you've tied it to political correctness, but going back and like, I defy anyone to sit down riveted and watch that movie. It's just a boring ass film. Anyway, be that as it may, a lot of comics have this feel, and for me, and I'm curious what people put in the comments. What kind of comics, what kind of stories did you either super love and then you went back to read them? I mean, I'll give you another example. The Boys. The Boys is a fun comic. I think it's okay, but there's a lot of filler and kind of the jokes. You start to get the same joke over and over again. They go back to a lot of the same bits. And if you have been watching the show, there's a big drama around Homelander and kind of the bigger things that are going on there, but not as much of that was actually in the comics. There were some, and don't get me wrong, I enjoy The Boys. I think it's a good comic. Garth Ennis did a great job, but your memory of it probably has been enhanced by the show and maybe kind of the overall novelty of what's going on in that series. And when you actually sit down and read issue by issue, it's not quite the same. And then for me, that's an example of something that hasn't aged. Hey, again, aging is the wrong word, but just where your memory is kind of tricking you a little bit as to what's going on. As most of you know, because I say it a lot, I'm a big fan of the X-Men, and I definitely have high respect and regard for Chris Claremont. But Claremont was not just always throwing in gold. Now, again, disclaimer, I'd take Claremont over the current slate of the X-Men any day of the week, even not as good Claremont. But if you look at like the Extreme X-Men series he did, what memories do you have of that? You actually had a decent art team. I think Salvador Larroca was on that for a decent period of time. And not a lot went on. I mean, Rogue got tattoos maybe, or like there were pieces of that comic that just, they introduced some new characters who have wandered into the memory hole. Claremont came back after Harris kind of exited him, and, he did a brief bit of DC and he Fantastic Four was kind of around in there somewhere. But when he came back to the X-Men, a lot of the stories are very forgettable. And it's easy to say, Claremont was the greatest X-Men writer of all time. I think there's a reasonable argument to be made for that. But there's also a lot of other things in there that just didn't, your memory of it is stronger than it actually is. For that matter, there's, around Blackest Night, which is an event that's generally, I think people love that comic. The main series was nice and tight, and there's some good things there, and it was a nice big get for DC at the time. A lot of the tie-ins were not just forgettable, but in some cases bad around that event. It wasn't like everything did well. There's a lot there that was, and then the they did the the countdowns and the various weekly titles around that. Remember Batman Eternal, that weekly book? There's a lot in there that just kind of we may have good feelings about because maybe Scott Snyder was writing it and that's somebody we know, or there may be different elements that get you your perception is it's good, but when you've actually gone back and read it, it isn't the case. So I'm curious in all this, where do you think your mind is tricking you? What's something that you either think is terrible and you came to realize it's not that bad, or great and you realized it's not that good, but where other factors are kind of tricky? Because I think right now in comics, we're actually in this interesting point where, certain artists, certain creators are being kind of lionized as being, untouchable, and everything they've done is great. And they've had plenty of stinkers in there, many have. Or there's the idea of new comics equal bad, old comics equal good because of, various YouTube channels and other things that are being said. But in that social war, a lot of there's a lot of, really duds in old comics that if they were published today, people would be sleeping on them at best or attacking them at worst. So it's just interesting to think about. So my question is to you, long-winded way of saying, what comics have aged well for you? what comics have aged poorly for you? But most importantly, where do you think your mind is making you feel better or worse about something that, if you really stop to think about it, you're kind of doing it to yourself. Let me know in the comments below. Like and subscribe, of course. And thanks for listening.